Hi there, everyone. I just wanted to make a quick video about what I've been thinking about The Last of Us 2, and specifically Dunkey and Critical. So, on one hand, we have Dunkey, and he kind of gave The Last of Us 2 4 stars out of 5. While it's received universal, critical hate, I would say, his point was that you should actually play the game before you judge. Meanwhile, on the other side of the spectrum, we have someone like Critical, who, going with a little bit of emo hair here, who has claimed that, much in congruency with the rest of the internet, that it is a terrible, awful game from a narrative perspective. So, between these two opinions, you have to ask who is right, or who is at least more accurate. And well, I think that this example presents a good opportunity to exercise what I call, and what most people should refer to as, the gamer spectrum. And where we have on one side gameplay, and on the other side narrative. Now, I bring this up because I've seen many games that either people like or people do not like. And I feel that, as cringy as it is to say, to identify yourself as a gamer is insufficient because there are so many different types of games. We, at this point, as a culture, find it more useful to be specific. This also reflects the kind of people that Critical and Dunkey are. So, for example, when Dunkey makes his videos, they're very kind of short, to the point, relying a lot on humor and kind of the feel of the game itself. Dunkey is very much tuned into the gameplay and how a game feels. Is the game actually fun to play? Is it fun? And as Reggie famously said, if it's not fun, why bother? On the other side, we have Critical, who his content, usually most of it now, is just him talking to the screen. It's just him talking about a story and a narrative, and usually what he presents is typically a fair telling of two sides to one story. So I would say maybe Dunkey's videos are quicker and more entertaining, while Critical is a little bit more drawn out and more nuanced in some ways, but still very much entertaining. So what would be some examples here on this gaming spectrum? Well, I guess on this side, closer to here, we could have something like Call of Duty. And on the other side, we might have something like Fragile Dreams. Pharaoh Rumors to the Moon. So one of these games is more skill-based, and one of these games is more narrative-based. And while I love Fragile Dreams, I can never recommend this game to anyone because it is pretty darn broken. There are some sections of the game that are just completely just broken. Like you're falling through the floors. There's like holes in the floor, and your character Seto is walking along, and he's got his little thing and his robot on his backpack or whatever, and he's walking along, and it's hard to explain. You have to see gameplay of it. But the point is that this game is broken, but its story is amazing. Its atmosphere, its character. It's not just the character himself, Seto. It's the whole environment that you're in that actually breathes life into the actions you do. Meanwhile, with COD, retrospectively, looking back on it, compared to what we have now, it actually has a pretty decent story if we're talking about Modern Warfare 4. But most people are not picking up COD for an engaging, interesting story. They're engaging for a skill-based, entertaining shooting game. That's why people come to COD. And, I would put the likes in here, like Counter-Strike, because these are the kind of games that, give that experience. In this area, it's more so about how the game plays rather than why. I often think about, movies like The Matrix. And before that whole shoot 'em up scene at the end of that movie, if you were to show someone to that out of context, would it still be as badass or as engaging? And I would say, for me at least, it would be no, because you wouldn't know the why they're doing it. or the why the action is taking place. It's the reason and the motives that make a fight or an engagement interesting. However, some people don't care what the reason for the engagement is, as long as the engagement is interesting and fun. As long as the engagement is interesting, interactive, and dynamic, that's important. I mean, the obvious conclusion is that your game that you want to have is right in the middle between these two. You want to have a combination of gameplay and narrative. And I feel that this is a spectrum that a lot of games can fall into. Some games are too much gameplay, and that's okay for most people because they are games. But the narrative, I believe, is what make games very unique, very interesting, and very dynamic ways to tell stories in very different and nuanced ways. And for me, this is more so what I like. However, I do recognize that some games in this category can be too far into a narrative if they don't have proper gameplay. So the sweet spot is, of course, right in the middle. So, what are some examples of some Team Fortress 2? At least in the sense that TF2, it doesn't necessarily have a story, but each class actually has a character, and it does have a very distinct aesthetic style. It has a distinct music style. And more than that, another axiom I forgot to mention is that this side is more competitive, while this side is more cooperative. So TF2 is a perfect example of this because it's a team-based competitive shooter. While your skill is being tested in a competitive way, you also rely on your team in a cooperative manner. And if you don't want to be too competitive, you can always switch to a support class. And so games like this, I feel, are very effective. Action adventure games, which is a huge field. I would say Zelda, Halo, Devil May Cry, Sonic, maybe. Yeah, I'd say Sonic. All these games, and these, I believe, are the core games that people love the most out of the video game community. And why is that? Because it's not just narrative, it's not just gameplay, it's a good mixture of both. And I think I might delve further into the kinds of gameplay that each of these have, but I find that some of the best games have a lot of variety of gameplay. For Zelda, every time you get a new weapon, it brings in this new little sort of gem in the crown of the game. There's a new thing, a new kind of mini segment that is set up for you. And it's always in the narrative of the story. You get the Megaton hammer at the Fire Temple. So that item that you get isn't just, oh, cool, now I can do different things with this item in the game. But that weapon is also tied to the culture and the atmosphere of the area where you got it. The lore of that weapon is now tied to it. I would say, well, maybe this is stretching it, but I would say it's more so over here, but a game like Dark Souls. Now, this is a bit of a tricky one because Dark Souls is very much dependent on gameplay, but it also does have a very pretty decent and complex story. It's just not told directly, which is why I would say this is more so a little bit over here on the gameplay side. But again, there's a game that very much has a nice blend of both. So DMC, for example, you can be on this side or this side, but if you want to be just gameplay and just play DMC, you can do that. The amount of things you can discover in the gameplay of DMC is just incredible. But while you go through that, it also has a very good narrative, depending on which one you play. But the narrative, let's say, of 3 is fantastic. You have a brother, rival, sibling rivalry, along with, the lore of the world and everything. And so DMC is a thing that inhabits both worlds. Maybe it should be a bit more over here, but you get the idea. So again, this is the sweet spot that a lot of people want to find. And again, maybe this should be more over here, maybe DMC and Dark Souls. And of course, another thing that this side hates is cutscenes. This is something I've honestly personally never really understood is that people would complain about how many too many cutscenes there are. I mean, sometimes that would be an issue. I mean, I found that the Metal Gear Solid series, it's not entirely the problem that there's too many cutscenes, but there are too many interspersed cutscenes. My issue is either I'm playing the game or I'm watching a cutscene. I don't want to have 10 minutes of cutscenes followed by 5 minutes of gameplay and then 10 more minutes of cutscenes. I want to have distinct sections. If you're going to do a cutscene, just let all the cutscenes happen at once, and that's how it should be. While on this side, I mean this might be universal, but tutorials where it's overly complex and you have to read a ton are awful. If you have a game where the tutorial is taking way longer to do than most normal games, that's not good. The key concept for most games is that they should be easy to learn, difficult to beat, and then hard to master. And so the question is, where do you sit on the spectrum? Well, let's take a few activities actually, and let's bring it to the extreme. What is the most far gameplay thing you could ever imagine? Well, I would say over here on the far end, we're going to have something like gacha. These are games that have a story, but it's simply exploiting the gameplay for financial purposes. So things like Azur Lane, and I don't need to list them out for you. You know what the gachas are, along with these other games like mobile games, Anime Girl, and you're getting your dailies and whatnot, and those are her arms on her hips, of course, and you're getting your dailies, and it's bing bing wahoo. But of course, it's not the coins you're collecting, it's the real money you earned and slaved through to that you can spend on bing bing wahoo anime girls. So I'd say that's the far gameplay side. On the far narrative side, well, that might be a little bit more straightforward. You have things like VNs, visual novels, walking simulators, things like the Stanley Parable. While it is a very fascinating deconstruction, and finally we have games that are, I'll call them story games. Story games are any Telltale, basically. And so these are games where, for example, Detroit Become Human. So these are games where, honestly, this is a movie, really, pretty much, with optional dialogue and choices. And it's true, you can do different paths, different patterns. There are button prompts in this. Certain visual novels, they allow you to read different branches in the story, and you can go back and reload saves, and only once you've actually read all the things will it allow you to read the master story. So there is some kind of gameplay concept in here that's part of a story that you otherwise could not do if it was in a game. Because you can load previous points and the outcomes of your things change. That's very similar to games like 999, for example. So 999 does have puzzles, so I'm going to put it over here. So it's a bit over near narrative, and it has more so some puzzles, but without the puzzles in 999, it would just be a visual novel with branching stories. But that is also a game I love, and a very fascinating conceptual game. And of course, you have walking simulators like the Stanley Parable, which is again interesting, but you're not doing much. So here's kind of the spectrum of all our games. But you know what? I'm not satisfied, because I want to push this almost beyond games. So what is the most extreme thing we could ever get on the gameplay side? I think the most extreme we can get over here, and this doesn't have anything to do with Donkey, but we're gonna have gambling, slot machines, and pachinko. So this is just a game with no narrative, no story, nothing. They just want your hard-earned money, and they want you to play the game. And on this side, the most extreme thing we would have over here would be, well, I would say any game that passes itself as art is usually total BS. Yeah, I'm going to put down Her Story. As far as I can tell, this is just a series of interviews with a woman telling a story, and you have a few button prompts you play in order to progress it, but there's not even a visual novel concept where you actually have to, say the right dialogue or piece together the story and then go back and say the right combination of dialogue. Like, as far as I could see, it was just button prompts and just playing video clips. And I would say the even more extreme of this would be a DVD menu. So, the most extreme thing here is like, okay, you have to press the play button. So, hey, technically that's a game. You have to press a button and then something happens. That's a game, right? This is kind of where the spectrum kind of crumbles and breaks down, because these are the two extremes that exist. Total, just pure dopamine, from interacting with an electronic device, and then the least amount of interaction possible for your entertainment. And again, very too lowbrow, I guess, depending on what kind of movie you're watching, but no, too lowbrow activities. If there's any offense to gamblers, you should be offended, because this is an addiction and it's a problem. Again, I want to also bring up another good point, that just because a game prioritizes gameplay over narrative, or vice versa, or the sweet spot in the middle, doesn't mean it's good. Case in point, Mass Effect Andromeda. I can't remember what the symbol looks like. I know the first one, it shows like Mars and there's the light coming out and there's the spaceship, and it's like, I'm on the Normandy because that was in World War II, don't you know? Anyway, that's the best spaceship we're gonna get. Anyway, so there's a game that, well, traditionally was a focus of narrative and gameplay. I would say even it was more so on the narrative side of things, at least with the first one. It was very much, we're going to tell the story, and especially with the second one, we're going to have all these characters, a huge cast of characters and their interactions, their stories, and difference between lines. Regardless of how Mass Effect ended, it's a great series and I love it. I didn't play Andromeda though, because I just saw it and I just knew. So again, just because you prioritize this doesn't mean you're going to get it. But the best games do end up, I feel, in this core area. And again, this is kind of, a subjective thing. What you value is going to be. So again, I think these are the best games for me. But for everyone else, that might not be the same case. But it's a safe bet that this will at least be somewhat liked, because it appeals to the two great pillars, if you will, of gaming. So, in conclusion, what can we say about this scenario? Well, first of all, the gaming review industry is totally corrupt. Some people are finding this out now with The Last of Us 2. So the one thing that we can say is The Last of Us 2, even Dunkey gave it a 4 out of 5. So it's not a perfect game. And it's definitely, I can tell you right now, that a lot of people are very upset with this. So, and of course, what did the reviews say? Well, the critical reviews say that this is a 10 out of 10 game, thought-provoking, amazing, incredible, etc. And what do the fans have to say about it? Well, it's garbage. Typically, the ratio that I usually see, at least last time I checked Metacritic, is that critic reviews were at 90% versus user reviews, which are hovering around 40%. And it's funny because I see the same review in other pieces of media, and I don't think I need to say which ones. But it's interesting that when there is such a disparity between the user reviews and the critic reviews, something's up. Something is going on. And of course, to say that the game review industry is totally corrupt, I mean, you might be finding this out now. You might have found it out at Gamergate. It doesn't really matter because this very much is putting it in your face. Personally, I figured this out in 2007 when they reviewed Halo 3. As much as I like that game, they openly said that the last few levels of the campaign were not great, and the campaign in Halo is very important. And they mentioned certain issues and difficulties, but they still gave it a 10 out of 10. I don't care how passionate you are. If you admit that there's something kind of wrong with the game, it's going to make it a 9. But, that was my first hint, I guess. I was like, I don't know about these guys. But yeah, since this feels like a mini Gamergate. It's like, oh wow, did the did this awful game really actually get 90% raving reviews, blah blah blah? Like, no. The second point is that different ways to objectively value and appraise a game, the ultimate praise of a game, part of it will come from this spectrum. Whether you value gameplay and the feel and functions and features of a game and, the amount of gameplay you get out of it versus the narrative, the feeling, music, and mood of the game will also factor into it. And how much it factors into it will depend on where you sit on this spectrum. Are you someone who wants more so gameplay and doesn't care about story? Or do you actually care about the story and the narrative a lot? And gameplay might be, kind of tertiary for you. And my only point with making this graph and making this point and this distinction is for everyone to be aware of their own biases. Because if you say you like something and you can't say why, well, there's actually a pretty good reason right here. And the more you know about yourself, the more you can explain it to other people. I think we've all had an experience where, a friend has asked us for a game recommendation and we've given them our favorite game and they didn't like it. There's been times when a game reviewer gave our favorite game a bad score and we could ask, how could they do that? There's been times when we can find an internet forum. Literally anywhere on the internet, you can find a forum where someone hates your favorite game. I can guarantee it because it's the internet. And the question is why? Why? Because people have preferences. And there are a select few that are way over here, or have a big $sign in front of them. And depending on those factors, it'll influence their decision. And we have to, just be conscious of, I would say, this unconscious, to bring the unconscious into the conscious, to be like, yeah, I am a person who likes narrative more than gameplay, or I like a person who has gameplay more than narrative. Personally, for me, I'm more over here with the narrative. I'm more willing to tolerate a game with bad gameplay and great music than a game with bad music and good gameplay. And that's just part of being human, really. But yeah, I hope this spectrum helps you, and I hope you can appreciate the nuance of different opinions across the board. All right, guys. Thank you.